Shogu always appears in uniform. He's never spent a day in the military in his life. He's been a civilian all his life. But as Minister of Defense, as a courtesy, he gets a uniform. So he gets a uniform as a 4-star general, and he's got medals, a chest full of medals. He hasn't won a single one of them doing anything. So there's 3 possible areas around Bakhmut, around Velika Novosilka, and then further west, south of Orkiv, which looks like the biggest that they've made so far. They've got more space there than they've got through a lot of the minefields. Now, they may or may not go for that space because a lot of strategic deception is likely to be involved. But somewhere along the front, a 750-mile front, they've got to commit themselves to pushing their heavy weapons, their heavy forces, these armoured brigades, through one of the gaps. And that will be risky because the Russians have still kept quite a lot of their defences intact. They are stretched. The Russians are not finding it easy, but they're certainly not collapsing. So, yes, there's some risk involved.
And as you just kind of alluded to, you outlined in this article these 3 routes to victory, you call it. Could you just take me through these a little bit more in depth?
One route in the north is north and south of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are not trying to take back Bakhmut, the city as such. If they surround it, then any Russians there will have to withdraw or surrender. In particular, the high ground south of Bakhmut. If they can push on there, they then have the choice, if they put a big force through there, of maybe turning south into Donetsk, and they can then start to take back some of the ground that they lost even in 2014. So that's quite an attractive idea, to win back some of the Donbass. Now, they've got to be careful because the Russians themselves look as if they've been trying to sort of counterpunch north of that from Kreminna and Svatove towards Kupiansk. The Russians aren't getting on very well with that, but they do look as if they've still got quite a lot of forces massed around there, and the Russians might try this counterpunch further north, which would negate the advantages which the Ukrainians might get at Bakhmut itself. So that's a complex area. The second area is Velika Novosilka, which is to the west, and then Vuhledar slightly to the east of that. And that's another area of pressure down to the south. If the Ukrainians feel they can push through there, they would probably head for Mariupol on the coast of the Sea of Azov. And that would make a certain amount of sense. And again, there's high ground. The high ground at Vuhledar they've already got. And when you get high ground, particularly in a country like Ukraine, that matters because there's so much other ground you can see. If you're on the high ground, if you're on the ridges, then you can control a very large area. But the most profitable route is what I call Route 1, which is from Orkiv through Tokmak to Melitopol and then straight onto the coast, which would be onto the Sea of Azov. But it would be so close to Crimea that from there, if the Ukrainians are able to push to the sea, and that's 120 miles away still, if they are, then they would be able to dominate Crimea. They could bombard Crimea, they could launch air attacks, they could launch HIMARS attacks, lots of things they could do. So the 2 things that would do, without trying to actually invade Crimea, which would be a different matter, but they could make the 4 air bases and the naval base at Sevastopol completely unviable, because they could keep bombing them. It'd make it impossible for the Russians to keep any aircraft or ships there. And believe me, that would make life for the 800,000 Russians who live in Crimea. Most of them are incomers. They've moved in since 2014 when it was illegally occupied, and think that they can live there for, it's a very comfortable, very nice area, very Mediterranean sort of place. They think they can live there for the rest of their lives. Well, it would make it unviable for them. And so the Ukrainians, if they could reach the coast south of Melitopol, they could make Crimea a complete no-go area for the Russians, both militarily and in civilian terms. And that would be a massive crisis for Putin. It'd be a huge bargaining chip for Ukraine, and it would be a strategic gain. Wouldn't end the war, wouldn't give them total victory, but my goodness, it would be a big step towards some sort of ceasefire on very favorable terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've said in your article that Kyiv's giving the impression that they will use Route 1, but could that actually just be a strategy of deception? Maybe they'll use one of the other routes that you've outlined.
Deception is always entirely possible in these circumstances. It's a bit like the Normandy invasion of 1944, the famous D-Day invasion. Everybody knew it was coming. The Germans knew it, the French knew it, the British knew it, people in the street knew it, everybody knew. But nobody, apart from a very small number of Allied planners, knew exactly when and exactly where. And out of that inevitable situation. It was inevitable that there would be an invasion in 1944. It is inevitable that the Ukrainians will launch most of their forces through one of these three gaps, or maybe a fourth one if they could open it. But we don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly where. So strategic deception is always possible. And the Ukrainians themselves may not have made the choice. They may be seeing what lies on each of those three areas. They've made three reasonable breaches through the Russian defenses. They might be looking at each of them and saying, well, which is our best advantage? It's a mixture of deciding where can you get through, and having got through, what gains you get from getting to the other side of the fortress, as it were. How likely is it that the Russians would actually collapse if you get through this area, or will they not collapse? They'll just withdraw in good order. And the danger for the Ukrainians is that they might penetrate through Russian defenses, but it'd be like penetrating a sponge. They'll get through, but the Russians will just pour more men and more equipment in, which will just close around the Ukrainians. And although the Ukrainians won't be defeated, they won't be victorious either. That's the risk, that they don't break the opposition; they just make the opposition behave like a sponge.
If let's say that Ukraine goes the Route One way about this, I mean, what sort of obstacles do you think they're going to be facing? Because we're already seeing landmines kind of slowing down the counteroffensive. They're facing attack helicopters, and the lack of air power means they can't, provide themselves with the coverage to push forward. What sort of things will they be anticipating?
The big problem with Route One is that the Ukrainians have not yet met the Sodovikin line. And the Sodovikin line, General Sodovikin, when he was in charge, he's been removed now, and we haven't seen him since the 25th of June anywhere. So maybe he's tied to a chair, having his toenails examined. We've no idea. But Sodovikin has disappeared, and his defensive lines around Tokmak are still there. And those defensive lines consist of just about everything. So there are anti-tank ditches, there are dragon's teeth, these sort of anti-tank concrete bollards placed in long rows. And of course, there are mines, and the Russians have placed about triple the number of mines that most militaries would have put per kilometre of ground into the area. And then they've created floods. The Russians have built a dam east of Tokmak to flood the ground to the east of Tokmak. And if Tokmak is occupied by the Ukrainians, almost certainly they'll blow that dam and flood Tokmak itself. So the Ukrainians are probably going to have to deal with some flooded ground as well. Now, all this can be done, and the Ukrainians have got some very good modern engineering equipment, which NATO nations have given them. But the point about all of this, particularly minefields, is that you can always get through them, but it slows you down. It narrows it canalizes you, so it narrows the channels through which you can move. And the enemy will have those channels targeted with their artillery. And so if you have to slow down, if you have to go through certain areas and relatively narrow lines of attack, then you're vulnerable to attack from the air, particularly helicopters, the Ka-52. Russian helicopters are very effective. They're attack helicopters. Also, their Su-25 aircraft with these, they're called the Fab 500 bomb, the glide bomb. And that's a very old bomb which got wings on it, so it can glide up to about 40 kilometers. And that's very destructive as well. And without air superiority, the Ukrainians, again, find this difficult because they've only got ground-based air defense. If they could control the airspace, then it would be much, much easier for them. It would buy them time to get through these obstacles. But as it is, they're going to have to work their way through the obstacles and probably accept a fairly high degree of losses as they go through. That may turn out not to be true. Depends on how much they have bombarded the rear areas of the Russian defensive lines, and that's certainly what they're trying to do. They're trying to get to the rear areas with their HIMARS, their multiple rocket systems, and their own air launch missiles in order to destroy that stuff. But I find it hard to believe they will have been able to destroy enough of it to get through the obstacles without taking a fair few losses themselves.
Yeah, and I feel a bit hypocritical or ironic for asking you this question because the whole article is about how general how they're being held to this kind of like impossible timetable. But you've also written that the next few weeks are really the test for Ukraine's military talent. I mean, do we maybe have a timeline? Is this something that we could be seeing before the summer's over?
The effective timeline is whenever the bad weather arrives. I mean, the weather hasn't been particularly good the last couple of weeks. It's been very wet, which is not good for the offence. But the really bad weather, the autumn weather, will arrive certainly in October, and after that, things will get very difficult. Not impossible, but really difficult to move forward. And so by then, by the end of the autumn, the Ukrainians have got to have achieved something that looks decisive to the West, not just good, but decisive, as if somehow they've changed the balance of advantage on the battlefield to make people think that this war could be over maybe sometime next year. That the Ukrainians are capable of throwing the Russians out of most or all of their territory during the next 12 to 18 months. If it looks as if, well, it's a stalemate and it'll go on for 4 or 5 years like this, then Western support is likely to decline. But if it's felt, well, look, another 6 months, 10 months, 12, 15 months will do it with more support, then I think Western support will remain fairly solid. And so it's a matter of perception. There's no particular objective which the Ukrainians have got to take. If they can reach the coast of the Sea of Azov, that'll be pretty good. If they can extend that line, if they reach the coast in a sort of a line and then can extend it outwards, that'll be even better. And if the Russians look as if they've cracked and are in retreat in 2 or 3 areas, that will be very good. But none of those things may happen. Somehow the Ukrainians have got to create an image that, yes, this war can be concluded on favourable terms in a politically foreseeable time frame, a year, 15 months, something like that.
I mean, it's quite unfair though, isn't it, to be holding Ukraine to this political timetable, which just simply doesn't really work when you're in the middle of a war.
No military campaign should be run according to political timetables, and that's a straight military doctrinal reality. But it is also a political reality that they always are. I mean, all military campaigns have some sort of political timetable operating behind them. And in this case, Ukraine's political timetable is not really driven by Ukraine, but it's driven by the Western allies. And the things that are looming on that is the beginning of the American presidential election, the degree to which the European Union and European powers are prepared to, as it were, remain constant with Ukraine. They'll all keep on supporting Ukraine, but how enthusiastic are they? Because it's getting very expensive. And also, the Western powers are all going to run into an armaments crisis in the autumn, whether Ukraine's successful or not. We've given Ukraine all that we easily can. Our own stocks are now getting lower, and we've not invested very much in building them up. And every European power is going to run into a crisis in the late autumn where it just simply doesn't have enough ammunition, enough sustainment, enough weapons, either to give to Ukraine or to maintain the levels that it thinks it needs to maintain with its own forces. And that crisis is coming, whatever happens in Ukraine. So, of course, it's very unfair on Kiev. And the most unfair thing on Kiev is the fact that we are now going to give them air power when it's too late. They'll get effective air power in F-16s sometime next year. If we'd have taken that decision 6 or 8 months ago, they would have air superiority now over the battlefield, at least, and that would make a huge difference. And so, as always, usually we've done too little just about in time. On aircraft, we've done too little too late. And the Ukrainians are trying something which we wouldn't try. We wouldn't do this. They have no choice, so they have to, and they have to try to create a modern combined arms approach to warfare in a matter of months. And we spent years developing this, and we're asking them to do it over 6 months. And the answer is, well, they've done some of it, but not all. And there's a debate, it seems to be going on now in Kiev, between whether they should keep on trying this combined arms approach, which they're not entirely comfortable with, or go back to their old Soviet-style tactics, which they do understand, and which their commanders feel more comfortable with. And if they don't succeed quite soon in breaking through, they might just fall back on their old Soviet-style tactics and say, well, just hammer away, do the best you can, and accept whatever big losses you have to take. I hope they don't do that, but I think there's a sort of tension building now in Kiev between persevering with a new style of warfare, which is quite hard to learn, and they've had to try to learn quickly, and falling back on the old one, which may succeed, but at horrendous cost.
And I wonder as well if the Ukrainians are maybe even kind of being forced or put in a position where they also have to hold themselves to a foreign political timetable, which is the US presidential elections. If Trump is, it seems quite likely to be receiving the Republican nomination. And, if he does, and let's say he is elected president, the US is the one giving the most weapons to Ukraine, and they know that. And Trump might take, a completely
Yeah.
different tactic on it. Um, is there, should Ukraine be worried about that possibility?
I think the United States will maintain its level of support for sure during the course of the campaign, right through to November next year. But the campaign itself may ignite a more fierce debate within America on the amount of money that's being spent and the strategic value to America of supporting Ukraine to this degree. Now, most Democrats have no problem with those questions, as most Europeans don't. But as the campaign gets going, it will be, one assumes, a very bitter campaign. And there's no telling what the internal dynamics of America will be. But I don't think American policy will change before a presidential election. But I do think America's attitude may change. And you'll see that in the press and the political debate and so on. And if that attitude changes, if it looks as if, a Republican candidate might win and therefore reduce support considerably to Ukraine or even stop it altogether, that will encourage Putin. It will encourage the Russians to hold on for a new government in Washington, and that will have an effect on the way the battle goes. So I don't think there'll be changes in policy in America, but changes in attitude may have an effect on the morale of the Ukrainians and of the Russians.
I wanted to move on a little bit to the Kremlin and Putin. We're just over a month on from Prigozhin's march on Moscow. The Russian military does still seem to be in quite a state of disarray, doesn't it?
The Russian military is in a very uncertain state at the moment, and I think there is ferment in Moscow. Putin tries to pretend that everything is normal, but of course it isn't. He's immensely weakened by what happened on the 24th of June, which the Prigozhin, the Wagner march on Moscow. The whole thing was a sort of farce. Nobody was in control of anything. Prigozhin didn't know what he was going to do next. Sorovikin seemed to know about it, didn't know what he was going to do. Putin didn't know what he was going to do. Everyone was sort of casting around to get a grip on this whole thing. And the whole thing was very chaotic. But in that chaos, it was also very dangerous, because what was clear was that the Wagner group felt they had some leverage over the Ministry of Defense, not necessarily Putin, but the Ministry of Defense. When they started this march on Moscow, a lot of Russian military units just sat on their hands. They didn't do anything. And the people who seemed most obviously to sit on their hands were the VDV, the airborne forces. And the airborne forces are the elite forces. They are in most militaries, and they're also very close to Wagner. They trained together at Molkino. Their base used to be, one of the bases was Molkino, where they were next door to each other. And a lot of VDV troops, retired from the military and then joined Wagner. So that they were very close. And what's happened since then is that Putin was then seen 5 days later from this march on Moscow on the 29th of June. There he was negotiating in the Kremlin with Prigozhin and 38 Wagner people. And he didn't even get what he wanted, with them sitting in front of him. These people who've been traitors the previous week, scum the previous week, were therefore, fated to tea in the Kremlin for a discussion, and they went away without having given Putin what he wanted. That's astonishing. And so Putin has certainly lost from that. But also the Ministry of Defense is in ferment, because there's a sort of purge going on. We're still trying to get to the bottom of how deep this purge is, how far it goes, of the VDV. And so clearly Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, are trying to do something about the loyalty of DVD commanders. They're not entirely certain about their loyalty. And the commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army, Ivan Popov, the best general that the Russians had on the ground, he was the man on the southern front, the Orikhiv front, that we were talking about, the man who's operating some pretty efficient defenses in the south. He was removed for criticizing the Ministry of Defense. And it's now sort of open season on criticism, is that a lot of senior commanders, on behalf of their men, are now criticizing the Ministry of Defense. So the MOD is involved in trying to, as it were, re-energize its control of its own units. Putin himself is standing away from that, but he's just weak, intrinsically weakened by the whole Prigozhin thing and the fact that Wagner still exists. They're in Belarus. That they will continue their operation in Africa, and Prigozhin is still a player in Russian politics. And then beside all of that, Wagner are not fighting in Ukraine anymore. A lot of VDV units have been withdrawn from some of their frontline roles. And the Russian troops that are there are complaining in these videos that I see every day, where a little group of troops, 15 or 20, they say, this is what's left of a company. A company of troops would normally be 100, 120 men, and there's 20 of them. And they say, this is what's left. And we've come back. We've got no ammunition. We were let down. Our commanders disappeared. They just left us to rot. And we appeal to you, Mr. Putin, Vladimir Validomich. They always call him that. So we appeal to you, Mr. Putin, to actually do something about all of this. And so the Russian army, although they are strong in their static defenses, are not in a particularly good shape. And I think the Prigozhin rebellion, if that's what it was, is still having ripple effects throughout the whole force.
Do you think that Shoigu and Gerasimov, do you think that they could be on the outs as well?
Yes, Shoigu has been supported by Putin. I mean, they're very old friends. They go hiking together, or used to. And a lot of people said, well, Putin is naturally close to Prigozhin because they go back to Petersburg and the old days of the crime gangs and so on. But Shoigu is closer. And Shoigu has a much better reputation throughout Russia because he used to be the man for emergency operations. And so he was the man who dealt with floods and natural disasters. And he has quite a good profile in Russia. And it looks as if Putin believes in Shoigu more than he believes in Prigozhin. Gerasimov is a bit of an outsider to this. But I think Shoigu is actually, you don't hear much about him and he doesn't say very much in public. But I think quietly he's consolidating his power. Although it's shaky, he's consolidating it. Gerasimov is in a more vulnerable position, I think. And of course, none of them really know what Putin is thinking. Because like all dictators, he operates only with a very close circle of people who are not really political at all. They're just his backers and his friends and people who've been bankrolling him for years. And nobody quite knows when he's going to turn on any given member of the ruling group.
You said Shoigu's he's trying to consolidate his power. I mean, could you elaborate on that a little bit? Do you mean that he could kind of pull a Prigozhin? Is that more? Do you mean something else?
Shoigu certainly has no love for Prigozhin. I mean, it's been rumored that Timchenko, one of the oligarchs, has had a contract out on Prigozhin for over a year. And certainly it is believed that a lot of people will target Prigozhin and they'll certainly kill him if they can. Shoigu's got his own private army, remember, himself, called Patriot. And so, like all of them, there's at least 20 to 25 private military companies running around on the Russian side of the war. And some of them are just security forces, like Gazprom and Rosneft. They've got their own security forces, and some of them are doing some fighting. But there's groups like Wagner, and Patriot has become a bit like Wagner, and that is essentially belongs to Shoigu. And Shoigu is a very rich man, and he's got a lot of interest in the Donbass region, and so he's been consolidating his economic power, but also consolidating his authority over the armed forces. And in that respect, I don't think he's that close these days to Gerasimov. I think we always talk about Shoigu and Gerasimov together. Shoigu, the defense minister, Gerasimov, the head of the armed services. I'm not sure they're so close together. And one of the big differences, of course, Shoigu always appears in uniform. He's never spent a day in the military in his life. He's been a civilian all his life. But as Minister of Defense, as a courtesy, he gets a uniform. So he gets a uniform as a 4-star general, and he's got medals, a chest full of medals. He hasn't won a single one of them doing anything. He's a civilian. Not a day in the military. But he is consolidating his control over the military, and Gerasimov is isolated somewhat from that central group. Shoigu is still in that central group, as far as we know, with Putin.
It's interesting, though, because those are actually, as things stand, the three men, Putin, Gerasimov, and Shoigu, who, if Putin decided that he wanted to push the big red nuclear button, those are the three people that have to say yes. It's
Yeah.
interesting the kind of politics and things that are playing out there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's a three key firing chain. Yeah, all three, the president, the Minister of Defence, and the Chief of the General Staff all have to agree that they're going to, as it release the nuclear codes. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about kind of what we're seeing on the border of Poland. Poland and Lithuania have warned that Wagner fighters that are currently stationed in Belarus could attempt to destabilize NATO's eastern flank. What do you make of this?
There's a lot of talk about Wagner operating to destabilize NATO. I don't think they will, and I'm not sure they will try, and I don't think they will at all succeed. The, the vulnerable area is which goes the Suwalki corridor, which runs from Lithuania, of course. Sorry, from Kaliningrad within Lithuania, and Kaliningrad is Russian territory. It's the old Russian base there, and the Suwalki corridor runs from there to Belarus. And that corridor is NATO territory, but it's not very. It's quite narrow. And the idea was if you create incidents along the Suwalki corridor, then you can, in theory, call in Polish troops that might end up fighting Belarusian troops, and then you've got a sort of a European crisis on your hands. It's possible that Wagner would try that. I mean, that's the sort of thing they do in Africa fairly successfully. But Europe is a different place. Europe is much more institutionalized. There's a great deal more independent surveillance of what is going on, and NATO is very well equipped for crisis management. So I don't think that Wagner would have much success in doing that. More success is likely to be achieved in trying to create false flag operations to persuade Belarus to get involved in the war in Ukraine, to convince the Belarusians that they are somehow under attack from Ukraine, not from NATO, but from Ukraine itself. I think that would be a more conducive role for Wagner to play if they want to play a subversive role. Even then, I think I'm not sure they would succeed, because this war is pretty unpopular with the public in Belarus. And the Belarusian army is extremely weak. They're quite small. They're not well equipped. They're certainly not well trained. They wouldn't make a whole lot of difference to the war, even if they did join in.
Thank you to our guest today. He is the renowned Michael Clark. He writes fantastic articles often in the Sunday Times, and this one in particular had interactive maps and really insightful information on how the war in Ukraine is going to proceed and what it means for the Kremlin. If you'd like to read more from Michael Clark, you can subscribe to the Times and the Sunday Times with the link in our description. Thank you very much.